So we've handled Elizabethan and Jacobean portrait miniatures at this gallery for over 2 decades now, but this is actually something which I think is far rarer. And of course, you and I know this as a cabinet miniature. But I think maybe to start, in your words, how would you describe a cabinet miniature?
Yeah, of course. So cabinet miniatures were really something that Nicholas Hilliard innovated in around the 1580s, and these were miniatures kind of painted on a larger scale, so they were often rectangular in format, and they were bigger than the conventional portrait miniatures. So Hilliard created these cabinet miniatures, which were sort of portraits in a more elaborate setting. But it was really the next generation, Peter Oliver and also Isaac Oliver, his father, who innovated this sort of new genre of cabinet miniature that had religious and mythological scenes rather than being a sort of conventional portrait. Cabinet miniatures themselves were also displayed in a different way to portrait miniatures. As we know, portrait miniatures of this period were often worn, they were handled, they were kind of very intimate objects that were kept on the body often. Cabinet miniatures, on the other hand, were designed to be displayed in something known as cabinet rooms, and these were sort of small studies which contained small works of art, books, prints, other sort of small objects of curiosity.
So we know obviously that cabinet miniatures were very popular amongst that sort of elite group of connoisseur collectors at that date. I mean, even Charles I collected them.
So cabinet miniatures really took off under Peter Oliver, and it was he who really kind of made this genre popular. He was commissioned by Charles I to create a series of cabinet miniature copies after paintings in Charles I's own collection, and these were paintings by artists like Titian, Correggio, really the sort of pinnacle of the Italian Renaissance. And Charles I had a real love for the Italian Renaissance. So he commissioned Peter Oliver to paint these miniature copies, which he displayed, and subsequently other aristocrat courtiers also commissioned miniatures of the same sort of scene from other miniaturists, and this genre really took off.
A lot of people, I think, in modern times would consider a copy to be slightly derivative, but that's obviously not how they were interpreted back then.
No, not at all. So during the period in the 17th century, some types of copying was really highly appreciated. They did have an understanding that there was a distinction between a sort of slavish copy and a more imaginative copy, and this would have really been considered the latter. It was described contemporaneously as a translation from the oil painting into the sort of English visual language of miniature painting. So this would have really been seen as a sort of translation from something by Titian, a Venetian master of oil paint, into the English tradition of watercolour painting.
And it's quite a sort of a tender scene. I mean, he obviously could have chosen to copy anything, including sort of a gory crucifix if he wanted to. But I wonder why it is this particular scene that he chose to copy.
Yeah, so the Rest on the Flight into Egypt, which is this scene, is a biblical scene that was particularly popular during the Renaissance and subsequently. It shows the moment at which Joseph and Mary and the Christ child take a rest on their journey to Egypt after they hear that King Herod wants to kill the Christ child. This is a particularly sort of family scene, it's a very tender scene, and it was very appealing to collectors of the period. So that was one of the reasons why this might have been a scene that Charles wanted Peter Oliver to copy. Beyond that, it has these connections to the original work by Titian, and Titian was hugely, hugely popular during the period. So the very fact that this is a miniature copy after Titian sort of added to its significance, because collectors would have valued it because of that relationship to Titian as well.
So we know that this work exists in 2 versions, and there is, of course, a signed and dated version of this exact composition in the V&A. And that one, we believe, was the one in the collection of Charles I. So where does this work fit in relation to that?
So we do believe that the one in the V&A was likely the one that was in Charles's collection. That miniature is signed and dated, and a man called Abraham van der Dort, who made an inventory of Charles I's collection, recorded that there was a scene of this by Peter Oliver in the collection that was signed and dated. So we can fairly conclusively say the V&A version was that. However, we also do know that Peter Oliver made duplicates of the works he gave to Charles I to keep for himself. So we know that from a descendant of his who kind of informed George Virtue, who writes about Peter Oliver, about that. We know that following Peter Oliver's death, his widow, Anne Oliver, had many miniatures belonging to Peter in his collection, and at the time of the Restoration, Charles II actually went in disguise, apparently, to go and see Anne Oliver, And he recalls that there are many miniatures, unfinished, portraits and histories, which is exactly what this would have been described as, in Anne Oliver's collection. So I think it's highly likely that this miniature remained with the artist's family and was in the collection of Anne Oliver at the time.
So interesting, isn't it? And I mean, I think you really have to get up close to inspect this work, at very, very close quarters, just to really appreciate the quality. I mean, this is obviously painted using watercolour on vellum. What I really love about this work is actually the closer you look, the more you see, because every single little leaf on this tree is very, very delicately painted. And the foliage down here, for example, and the rocks and the faces which are painted with sort of very fine stippling technique. One element that I really love, which is quite easy to miss, is this little donkey here on just the furthest left-hand edge. But even the donkey's head is painted with such character.
He was known for that technique, and that was actually, we think, we're used to seeing miniatures in a way, and we actually don't really appreciate how hard it would have been to create something like this on this miniature scale. The original paintings by Titian that Peter Oliver was looking at and copying were painted with oil paint, and the way in which Titian painted flesh tones and the foliage and all of that sort of thing would be impossible to do in watercolour. With watercolour you can't layer up paint colours, it's just you have to apply it straight with stippling. So Peter Oliver really kind of masters Titian's effect in this new technique of watercolour painting. So it's a real achievement by the artist.
Yeah. And as I said, this is the only important cabinet miniature that we've ever handled. And why is it that you think there's so few in private hands? And of course there's a lot in public collections, but I think it's perhaps due to the time it would have taken to paint them, that they were just relatively few were painted in the first instance. Yeah,
so we know that Peter Oliver painted quite a few of these during the 1630s, and it seems as though there aren't many portrait miniatures by him from this period, so it's likely that these took up a huge amount of his time, and he was rewarded very generously by Charles I for making these. So that really sort of insinuates that these were very laborious, took him a long time to paint. In terms of why I think a lot of them are in public collections, we do still have quite a few of them in the royal collection, and I think following the Restoration, Charles II wanted to recollect things that his father had. So a lot of these kind of went back into public collections.
I think the point that you make is a very interesting one about the time it would have taken to have painted them, and also the level of esteem in which Peter Oliver was held, because he received the same annual payment, I think I'm right in saying it, as Van Dyck, who was of course one of the most successful painters in Europe at that date. So he was obviously considered by Charles I to be of an equal calibre, albeit in a different genre.
He definitely was. Van Dyck we really associate with the court of Charles I, all the portraits of Charles I by Van Dyck. And Peter Oliver was paid the same amount, so Charles I really valued Peter Oliver's work. And it wasn't really just Charles I. When Charles I's art collection was sold following his execution, these works sold for huge sums of money. Far more than any portrait miniatures, and even on comparable amounts to works by Rubens or Van Dyck.
So thank you very much for talking to us today about this, and of course for all the research which you've done on this work over the last few months.
That's no problem at all. It's so exciting to work on such a beautiful and rare cabinet miniature.